Hey YouTube, welcome to Rampage Reviews. I'm Rampage, and we are just a year away from that fateful discovery of Anakin Skywalker. But first, Darth Maul has to go to prison. He's evil. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. Let's dive in. So today we're taking a look at Star Wars Maul Lockdown. It's written by Joe Schreiber, never really remembered how to pronounce that. It takes place 33 years BBY. This is a year before episode 1. Very, very good book. I really enjoyed it. Joe Schreiber actually writes Red Harvest and Death Troopers, so he's already written some pretty awesome books. So the story starts out where Darth Maul is sent to a prison, and the prison is called Cog Hive 7, and he's sent there by Darth Sidious because he needs to find this infamous arms dealer. His name is Iram Radiq. He's trying to procure a nuclear weapon from Iram Radiq, but then also kill him in the process. Now, that's Plagueis' plan. Plagueis is alive at this point, don't forget. He dies a year later in episode 1, pretty much right before Palpatine becomes Chancellor. Plagueis' plan is for Maul to kill Iram Radiq and then get the nuclear weapon. Sidious' plan, however, is for him also to kill Iram Radiq, but to take the nuclear weapon and give it to this faction called the Bando Gora. I don't know if you're familiar with this faction, but it's a group of people that basically idolizes death. They only exist to spread death and destruction. It's probably as evil as you can possibly get for a group. They are led by a former Jedi named Komari Vosa, and they were at their highest point before the Battle of Naboo. So basically by episode 1, they've either disbanded or we don't hear about them in the movies at all. So I think they are canon, but just their activity that we know of is Legends material. The interesting thing about this prison is that it holds gladatorial competition between the inmates. So basically it comes up with an algorithm that pits two people together to fight to the death, and there are people all over the galaxy that are betting on this stuff. Also, when they enter the prison, they are injected with a really small bomb that sits right next to their heart, so if they do anything bad or they try to, I don't know, hurt a guard or something like that, then they can just be shut off at any moment. They can flip a switch and boom, it explodes their heart and they're dead. Maul, we find out, has 2 hearts. I did not know that Zabrax had 2 hearts, but they do. And so because he has 2 hearts, he has to have 2 bombs inserted. Maul runs through a series of competitions between different inmates, and he really shows off his expertise and his fighting skill and his overall strength. And there's one thing that Sidious told him, or there's many things he told him, but this one specific thing he told him was that he was not allowed to draw upon the dark side to fight anyone in the prison because he didn't want to give himself away as revealing the Sith at this moment. They did not want to reveal the Sith until they were ready to do it with the Jedi. At last, we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last, we will have revenge. So this kind of puts him at a disadvantage. He basically has to kind of wade himself through a series of inmates to try to figure out what the hierarchy is, like what the different gangs are, who knows information and who doesn't, and who knows about Iram Radiq. Radiq is a really slippery figure, if you will. He's very mysterious. There's many people who don't even think he's real. Plagueis actually started to believe maybe that he wasn't real. It was either Plagueis or Sidious. I can't remember. One of them said it's rumored that he's a myth, and the other one was like, no, he's very, very real. So just very mysterious. Nobody knows a lot of information about it except for the people that are closest to him. One being a inmate called Zero, and then there's a couple other inmates that know a lot about him. You meet in there. His name is Artagan. He's kind of an old resident of this prison, if you will. He knows about Iram Radiq because he actually served with Iram Radiq against the Bando Gora. He saved his life because the Bando Gora almost killed him. Years later, they never really kept in touch, and finally they met again through this prison. Iram Radiq said, hey, I'll take you under my wing, but there's one thing that you have to do for me. And he basically tells him he has to remove his eyes and then swear loyalty to him, to work for him. And he wasn't willing to do that. So basically he's had it out for him ever since. Artagan also has a son named Egan, and he plays a pretty significant part in this book as well. So once Maul is able to find out who Radiq is, he meets him in a room where they're about to fight, but then out of nowhere, Egan, the son of Artagan, attacks Radiq and is able to blindside him and kill him. Komari Vosa also found him literally right after this, and they get into a fight, but then there's this giant monster that lives in the prison called Sirox the Wolfworm. I've not done any research on wolfworms. They sound horrifying. This one feeds on the consciousnesses of dead inmates in the prison, and they have sentient thoughts too, so you can hear these dead inmates' screams and desperate thoughts go into your head when the wolfworm's going by. It's pretty freaky. This wolfworm finds his way to Komari Vosa and Maul. Maul actually helps her defeat the wolfworm, and then they get together because Maul is, according to Sidious's direction, supposed to get the nuclear weapon and give it to Vosa. So he does. They part ways. Maul goes back to Sidious, presumably. Mission accomplished. It was very difficult for him because he couldn't draw upon the Force. Just a lot of different, interesting connections in this book. So what did I think? It was dramatic, and I really appreciated the dramatic tone of it. There's a lot of goriness. Joe Schreiber is known for being very explicit in his descriptions of things and leaving nothing to imagination. Every single bloody detail he includes in his writing. So because of that, it adds to the drama of the story and the suspense. It's very fast moving. The chapters are really short. But the one thing that kind of brought my rating down a little bit is that there was nothing mentioned in the book that really tied it significantly to events in the Skywalker saga. You might be saying, well, not everything has to connect to the Skywalker saga, and that's true. Not everything has to. Since this takes place during that, and it involves major players in the Skywalker saga, one would think that when you read a story taking place during that time, that this story would affect events within that saga in some significant way. At least you would see how it did. And I didn't see that. It was basically just a standalone story about how Sidious wanted to take out, or at least create chaos between two major arms dealers, or two major factions in the universe, and also take out the arms dealer in the process, because he's basically competition to him. With that being said, the stories were still compelling. They were still pretty awesome to read, and I appreciated every bit of the book. It was very hard to put down. And now we'll get to some of the more interesting thoughts I had about the book that I was able to take note of. This was kind of a mistake on my part, but at the beginning of the book, Maul goes by a name Jagannath. I'm not sure what the pronunciation is there, but he goes by this code name. And at first I was thinking, wait a minute, are they revealing his real name? Is that his real name? And that can't be, because his real name is Maul, because when he was taken from his mother on Dathomir from Sidious, his mother said his name is Maul. It was the first name we knew him to have. So I knew right away that couldn't be his name. Then I started to think maybe it's retconning. No, he's disguised as a mercenary named Jagannath, so that's what everybody knows him as. Not super significant. Totally thought we saw some kind of retconning there if this were ever brought into canon, which is possible given some of the storylines. I mentioned it before, but Zabrak males have 2 hearts. I did not know this. This created a situation for Maul in the prison where he had to have 2 bombs implanted into his chest, not just 1. I don't know if there's any other species that possess more than 2 hearts. That's probably something that also contributes to his fierce fighting ability, because if you have 2 hearts, that's more ability to pump more blood to more extremities, and I assume you would get tired a lot less quickly than most people. This probably gives Maul an advantage as a fighter, which is just an interesting anecdote, really. Maul never really truly felt connected to the grand plan. He always felt like he was being used for these little errands here and there, which he was, and that was described in the last book, and Plagueis also, or Darth Plagueis, I should say. Because of this disconnection he had, he just felt like he wasn't a significant part, and he wanted to have a much more significant part with the Sith. And it was true. Sidious had spoken at length intoxicatingly about the dark side and its power, and more vaguely about the role Maul would play as he continued in his study of the Sith arts. In his most solitary moments, Maul had dared allow himself the hope for that moment when the Force would announce itself within him fully, intervening in a way that could not be mistaken for anything but sheer destiny. Could this be that moment? He literally has a big yearning to be more of a part of the grand plan, but he senses that he's more of a pawn than a major long-term partner for Sidious. In the book Darth Plagueis, you get the sense that Sidious and Plagueis had more of an equal role to each other. They thought off of each other, they banked ideas off of each other, and they learned together about different things about each other and about the Force and about politics. In this book, it seems like Plagueis is being much more distrusting, and it seems like he's trying to covertly figure out if Sidious is doing anything maybe against his will or against his wishes. They both displayed a little bit of paranoia, but Sidious's paranoia was much more prevalent, and I got the sense that he was more afraid of Plagueis in this book than he was in the last book. You definitely saw him talk more equally to Plagueis in the last book than you do in this one. While he does betray him in the end, you just see his paranoia come out a little bit more in this book. So I mentioned before about an inmate named Artagan that is a very successful fighter in this prison that they're in, Cog Hive 7, and he's fought several bouts, and he's won them all, obviously, because he's still alive. It leads me to believe that he's a very, very skilled fighter. He can fight most of the things that he's went up against, and considering what Maul went up against, they had to have been some pretty formidable fighters, I would think. Then later in the book, he gets into a fight with a guard, and then he just gets completely taken out. Artagan lunged at Voistock and fell on him, Voistock being one of the guards, ripping away the guard's belt, fighting with a ferocity that was ultimately pointless. Within a span of seconds, Voistock had rolled free and hammered Artagan twice in the stomach and once across the bridge of the nose, before smashing his skull with the butt of his blaster over and over. Maybe next time, wham! You'll listen, wham! When somebody tries to teach you, thump! Some carking respect. I hope you like the narration there. So he displays himself as a skilled fighter, but then he just gets knocked down and smacked in the face with a gun by a guard several times where he's eaten bloody on the ground. He doesn't die. It just seems a little bit inconsistent considering his record. Maul had just gotten into a fight with something else later in the prison, and then he had to return to his cell, to which one of the guards was waiting for him there right before he was going to be pitted against somebody else in a bout. The guard is instructed to wrap him with zip ties or tie him down to a bench on his hands, or wrist, I should say. And in the moment, it seemed like, so he's putting plastic zip ties guys around a Sith Lord, especially one like Darth Maul, who really just showed how physically formidable he is in this book, and that's supposed to hold him down, and it does. It pins him to the bench. What is that? How is that even possible? Later you read that it's Nyla steel. I don't know what Nyla steel is. Obviously something strong. It must be pretty strong to hold Maul down, but at first it just said zip ties, so I'm sitting here like, plastic zip ties are holding a Sith Lord down? What the heck is that? There's several times where Darth Maul has to come into communication with Darth Sidious to explain his progress in the mission he's on. Maul is really testing Sidious's patience because he's not really able to come through with the mission as quickly as Sidious wants him to. He wants him to come through with it now, and Maul is having a lot of difficulty, especially with how mysterious Iram Radic is. With his impatience, he starts to force choke Maul to really just assert his dominance, and it's one of the few times, I actually haven't even seen a time where Darth Sidious used force choke. That's the first time I ever read or saw him use it in anything at all. It's just not something that you often see him do. He's usually either force lightning or that's about it. His main go-to is force lightning, but who knows, maybe we'll see it again sometime. Jabba the Hutt makes a pretty grand entrance in this book because he actually is responsible for sending a bunch of guards undercover in this prison to try to also find Iram Radic, which is what Maul is trying to do. And he appears in a scene and they describe him as Jabba Desaligic Tiur. I don't know if that's his clan name or what that is. It almost seemed like it would be his real full name. Obviously his full name wouldn't be Jabba the Hutt. That seems to be his full name, Jabba Desaligic Tiur, which makes sense because he's a part of the Desaligic clan. That's probably has something to do with it. There's an entire chapter dedicated to Sirox the Wolfworm, and they describe where he's from. He's from a planet called Monsolar, or Monsolar, and this is kind of the description it gets into right away. Blind from birth, void of consciousness in any traditional sense of the word, it did not know that it was also called Sirox, nor did it have any sense of how far it had traveled from home. On its native planet, Monsolar, where its species had been revered for thousands of years, it had been worshipped as a god and dreaded like the plague, its silken bag tents clustering in the high branches and filling the nightmares of the local tribes. So it's this mythological creature to some of the tribes that were there that was terrifying to those people. Another appearance by this would be really, really interesting. I want to see that. Once Maul finds Iram Radic, you find out that Radic is a Chiss, and I don't know if you're familiar with that race, but that's the same race as Grand Admiral Thrawn. The blue skin, the red eyes, he's the same species. I don't know much about this species in terms of what they're mostly known for, but so far it seems like they're very intelligent and meticulous people that are capable of some pretty amazing things and organizing some pretty amazing events. Grand Admiral Thrawn obviously had a huge part in Rebels, the animated series that came out later, and he also appears in Ahsoka, so he's been a very menacing figure in Star Wars. Radic seems to also have the same kind of aura to him, and I'd like to see more of him in live action. Kamari Vosa was the Dark Jedi that led the Bando Gora, and you find out that she's a former Padawan of Dooku. And this is interesting because Dooku obviously turned to the dark side and left the Jedi Order so he could join Darth Sidious. At first it seemed like he was ready to kill Darth Sidious, and then later it seemed more like he was trying to take over with him, but it's possible he was maintaining this covert mission to take out Darth Sidious the whole time. You just don't know, because eventually Anakin got to him and the rest is history. But just Kamari Vosa being his Padawan and then going this path that seemed like Dooku took, it seems like Dooku was just such a different Jedi that he imparted a lot of that attitude that he had towards the Jedi Council and about the Force. And obviously Qui-Gon was sort of the same way. He obviously didn't have as much darkness in him, but he definitely questioned authority a lot more than other people. It makes Dooku a much more interesting figure in that sense. With Kamari Vosa being a Dark Jedi, we repeatedly see the big differences between the Sith religion and the Dark Jedi. I read before that the Dark Jedi actually started out as people who enslaved the Sith race, and the Sith actually worshipped them as gods in some way, and then eventually they became their own religion and embraced the dark side. But now the definition of a Dark Jedi seems to be much more selfish. Dark Jedi turn to the dark side from being a Jedi because of all of the things that the Jedi don't allow them to be. So because of all the restrictions, they feel like they want to break free and do the things that they want to do. So most of the time, the description of a Dark Jedi that you see is a very selfish one, where the Sith don't seem that way. They seem much more principled and focused and dedicated to their mission of dominance and also taking out the Jedi. Much less about selfish needs and much more about a bigger picture for them. Several times in this book, Darth Maul is getting into bouts with many different people, but each time he gets into a bout, it's always with a much larger monster each time. It always seems like it turns out with Darth Maul turning around and there's the next big enemy to fight, you know, whether it's Radic or the Wolfworm or Kamari Vosa. It seems like it's this never-ending chase to find the final boss of this game, and he never finds him, but eventually he does because he beats the Wolfworm and then works with Kamari Vosa in the end. So to that final boss came, but it took a really long time. Iram Radic's biggest product in this book was lightsabers that were powered by synthetic crystals crystals. This is not something I believe I've read or seen before, but I get a feeling that I might have read it. I just can't remember it. Basically, they didn't work correctly until Maul came along, and Maul was actually able to take a device and make it work in a fashion that reconstructed the chemistry of the crystal to where it would work properly in the lightsaber. Before, if you turned it on, the user would have the lightsaber whip back at themselves and basically slice them in the head or something like that. The blade did not stay straight and true. It was very unstable. This leaves it open, if ever brought into canon, that synthetic crystals can be created and used to make lightsabers instead of having to use kyber crystals, which is a very, very interesting thing, especially considering kyber crystals have a sort of connection to the Force. So do these synthetic crystals have a connection to the Force? Probably not, but you never know. When Maul gets into his final fight with Karmari Vosa, he envelopes himself in the Force to then perform the 7th lightsaber form known as Vapid, or also called Juyo. This is the form that many people think allows the user to tap into the dark side, especially if you're a Jedi, tap into the dark side without actually turning to the dark side and create a much more aggressive form for you to attack your opponent. Well, obviously Maul already embraces the dark side, so this form just allows him to just be bathed in the dark side instead of tapping into it. Very interesting to see that he knows this form. It's the only other Force user that I've seen or read use this form, I believe, unless I'm just not remembering correctly. And if you remember another one, put them in the comments. But that makes Maul extremely dangerous, in my opinion, and it almost feels like he was shorthanded in the prequel series because he just seems unstoppable in this book, honestly. That does it for all the things that I found interesting. I was kind of close to giving this book a 7.8 or something in the 7s just because it had that disconnection from the Skywalker saga. And like I said, not everything has to be connected to the Skywalker saga. If the story takes place during that time, you would think that since it's such a universe or galaxy changing time, that any significant event or story you would read would have a nature to it that would be event changing in some way, that would influence something we've already seen in the movies or in some of the animated shows that we've seen. So I was kind of being a little bit tough on it because of that, but then I realized actually as a standalone story, it is really awesome and it gives Maul a really great addition to his resume and makes him seem like a much more formidable fighter than we saw before. He already seemed like a really, really strong fighter before, but just the fact that he can just take out these huge monstrous things without drawing on the dark side and just ripping him apart, it seems like. He seems extremely dangerous in this book. And we've seen him in the animated shows. He doesn't even seem as dangerous in those shows as he did in this book. So with that being said, I'm going to give this book an 8.2. I think it deserves better than a 7.8. Did appreciate the story the way it was. So 8.2 today. I don't know if the book would ever be brought into canon because of that. Can it become canon? It's such a standalone story. Like I said, the characters all line up. Plagueis is still alive with the respirator on, so there's that. Sidious is himself, before he becomes Chancellor. Maul, his backstory lines up with what we know about Maul. We don't really know much about this prison before this point. It's introducing all of these elements. So because of that, I think it probably could become canon, but it's really going to become interesting coming up here when we read a lot of these stories that take place so close to each other. Right now, we're going to get into like 33, 32, then 31 BBY. It does skip over to like 22, but after 22 BBY, just everything's so close together. So you're really going to be able to see where all of the characters in the same places at the same time that align with where they were during the canon events. If they were, they can become canon. If they weren't, or there's something conflicting, then they can't. But that's something we're going to investigate as we continue on. So I hope you enjoyed the content that you saw today. If you did, just make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you wanted to read this book, there will be a link in the description. Just be aware that I am an Amazon affiliate. So if you click this link to purchase the book, it will benefit me or the channel in some way, but don't do it just to benefit me. Super appreciated if you do, but do it so we can continue this awesome conversation about Star Wars and just keep diving in to see how this huge story can mesh together, because really that's the dream, is to have all of these storylines mesh together so we can just sit and talk about and debate how things should be or how things are. Again, appreciate everybody that stopped by today. May the Force be with you, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.